Ready. Anybody have any questions or comments about what you went over Wednesday? If not, we'll go ahead and start in on the introduction here. The most important single archaeological discovery in the past 75 years is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Therefore, we need to be aware of the significance of this find. And as we get into this, we'll see if they're still being studied, and it's quite amazing how they did last. But the discovery in the summer of 1947, two Bedouin shepherd boys, Muhammad Adib and Ahmed Muhammad, who lived in the desert region west of the Dead Sea, were searching for a goat that had strayed into the hills west of the Dead Sea. One of the shepherds threw a rock into one of the many caves in that area and heard a crashing sound. He climbed up into the cave and discovered 8 large jars. From one of these, they drew out 3 leather scrolls. The scrolls were taken first to St. Mark's Syrian Orthodox Convent in Old Jerusalem, and later taken to the American School of Oriental Research on February 18, 1948. The scholars identified them as important documents. Some of the scrolls were smuggled out of the country and taken to America. Portions of them were hastily published. John Allegro, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the scroll of Ezekiel was lost because it became exposed to moisture and turned to glue. Allegro. F.F. Bruce related that some of the scrolls were actually advertised for sale in the miscellaneous columns of the Wall Street Journal in June of 1954. And second thoughts on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fortunately, the scrolls became the property of Israel, including the ones sold in the New York City newspaper, and are now housed at the Shrine of the Book Museum in Jerusalem, which you can see a picture of that there in the bottom left-hand corner. And in recent years, all the important scrolls have been published and are available both to scholars and the general public. Excavations at Qumran uncovered the ruins of the Qumran community and many other manuscripts. Fragments of and complete manuscripts have been found in at least 11 caves. A partial list of what has been found is given later. Studies of the recovered documents continues after more than a half a century. As we look here, what's the in that first paragraph, what's a few of the things that are important to notice here about the scrolls?
Well, the first thing was that they didn't merchandise them, which is a common custom in the Bible land. People were quite aware of ancient artifacts and such as what was stolen in Egypt, but some lot of them went on the black market. So I thought it was quite interesting that it ended up in a religious organization, as opposed to going just anywhere else, which preserved the books. We have copies of them, but obviously this community, which was kind of a almost like, I'm trying to think of the word they were called, but they gathered off by themselves and got in the community, and obviously they felt a necessity to preserve the written law. Perhaps they thought maybe Israel was becoming more liberal. I mean, you could just think of the reasons why they felt that they had to protect the books of the Bible from heretics and so forth, that it wouldn't be destroyed. And so that's why they were stored there. And also, I think these people were more what we would call today conservative Jews that were interested in truth, not in changing the manuscripts.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And speaking of the preserving of them, what do we see here that leads to those scrolls being able to exist for all that time, not being discovered till 1947? Yeah. Yeah, they was enclosed in the earthen jar, which would have helped with any humidity. What about their location?
In caves, in rooms.
Right, in a cave in a desert region. And what's the significance about them being leather instead of papyrus? Does that have any distinction? Would it allow them to last any longer? As you look at many documents, it was on papyrus paper, and they would deteriorate, fall apart. And even though the leather scrolls had deteriorated some, they were still intact enough that they was able to unfold and restore a lot of it to where they could see what the scriptures was. I think it's, as we can see, the one that wasn't taken care of, the one of Ezekiel, was lost because it became exposed to moisture and turned to glue. So it shows us anything of his archaeological digs, if they're not treated with great care, that they can be harmed or destroyed.
Papyrus is a reed, and so they would have slit the reed open, beat it with stone to make it into paper, but it would be strips up and down. So if you roll those, you can see where each reed would be put, and there'd be a chance of that breaking. So however thick the reeds were, every time it was rolled, it would break. Now leather would, as long as it was kept soft and supple, it would not do that, would not crack and so forth.
Right. So that's why it was good it did get into the Shrine of the Book Museum, where experts could deal with them and keep them very well preserved.
The manuscripts themselves, which is rather interesting, there's no deviation between the books that are found and what we have preserved in our Bibles.
Right.
So, if I've never heard, but if that was their concern, that the books would have been perverted by somebody along the line, and they were trying to preserve their heritage and their history, we still have the same thing. We still have the same books. Everything's the same in both of them. So that really shows something too. That God, as He said, was watching over His inspired book to make sure that we have all the truth.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Is that you can't just say, well, the Bible just came from a oral tradition. It was written down early in the what did they figure here? He thought it was between.
This would have been probably before the destruction of Jerusalem, or right after. It was right in probably a little before the destruction of Jerusalem.
I thought it said it was before Christ, about 175 years.
It could go back that far.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for there. I was thinking it was around 175 that they dated it. So it's quite amazing that did last, and like I said, it gave the soothsayers, the doubters, proof that this was written and it matches our word.
Well, the thing I would say is, if we ever put these here, it would take quite a lot of effort to have copied all that at that time. That would have translated into great monetary value if it was done today, all that effort.
Right.
The effort to preserve it, put it in that place. These were really dedicated people, whoever did this.
Yeah, they was looking out for the word.
They weren't the lower class of people. Somebody had some actual money or things to back this up when it was done.
Yeah, and the knowledge to transcribe it. So yeah, that's a good point.
They would have been scribes, as Richard talked about.
Yeah.
That's what they did.
Right.
They were probably Jewish priests or related to priests, and they were scribes. And it was probably like a monastery. We have that movement in the early church, these monasteries that were also to preserve sacred things and keep them so that they wouldn't be destroyed or lost. And so obviously this was evidently a sect of the Jews, and they isolated themselves, because you see here in the lower part of the portion of some of the excavations at Qumran, so there was a community there.
Right.
And obviously it was for this very, probably a religious community, like a monastery.
Exactly. And I think it shows there in the middle column where it says fragments of and complete manuscripts have been found in at least 11 caves. It shows they didn't put all their eggs just in one place, one basket. They had them in different caves, because as you can see with in Egypt with the Valley of the Kings, how many of those tombs were robbed, and they still think there's more tombs to be found, but they did well of hiding things, of making it to where it's not right out in the open. And that's one of the things that, as Mike said, they knew what these were worth when they was found. And it's amazing that they did end up in the hands of a religious organization that cared for them as they needed to be cared for. Anybody have any other comments here before we move on?
Makes you wonder if they, maybe like some people today, I'm sure we've got some movements, or soon we'll have, who feel that Armageddon's coming, so they're going to have to gather things up and put them in secret places and hide them, and so that they would be preserved. And so perhaps this was the philosophy behind this Qumran community, that some evidently had this feeling that Judaism was being distorted, and it was, especially during the Roman time. They were compromising their faith and going along with the Romans. So, every time governments get involved with the church, it's disaster. That's why we have the Holy Roman Catholic Church, is because of Constantine, who declared himself the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And you see what happened to Catholicism because of its connection with government.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've seen in our past studies with the kings how politics and religion got meshed together, and they was trying to appease all these people to get their kingdom greater instead of worrying about what God would have them to do. So yeah, it's a good point. Anybody else? Move on to the community at Qumran. Here are the conclusions of several scholars regarding the people who lived at Qumran. William Stanford Lasore writes, "It is my opinion that there can be no doubt that we are dealing with a separatist group, a group that had repudiated official Judaism." That goes along with what Mike was saying. These people separated off, refusing what the official Judaism was at that time. And as we get into this, we'll see some of those reasons why. Very early after finding the scrolls, Miller Burroughs wrote, "To sum up the net result of all the efforts to identify the Covenanters, we must first of all insist that any identification must observe the chronological limit set by the established age of the documents. The sect of the teacher of righteousness and his followers was clearly one of the groups formed within Judaism during the pre-Maccabean and Hasmonean periods. It may probably be accurately included under the term Hasidim, but that does not indicate a specific sect. In many ways it was akin to the Essenes. As we know them from sources of the Roman period, if this term is used in a broad, comprehensive sense, we may legitimately call the Qumran sectarians Essenes. For the present, however, in order not to prejudge the case, it seems better to reserve that name for the group described by Philo and Josephus, which, if their reports are accurate, was not exactly identical or coextensive with the Qumran community. As a matter of convenience, we may still designate the latter by the term Covenanters, which implies neither the acceptance nor the rejection of their identification with the Essenes. At any rate, it is clear that the sect of Qumran was more closely related to the Essenes than to any other group known to us. And that is the Dead Sea Scrolls 298. And Charles F. Pfeiffer summarizes the evidence as follows. As has been indicated, scholarship has not been unanimous in identifying the Qumran community as Essene. Saul Lieberman has pointed out comparisons between the Qumran community and the Pharisaic Habura, Pharisaic societies whose membership undertook to observe strictly the laws of ritual purity. M. H. Gottenstein has suggested an anti-Essene polemic in the Qumran scrolls, contrasting the Qumran emphasis on obedience to the law with the Essene emphasis on ceremonial purity. The ancient writers, however, are unanimous in their praise of the Essenes for their high morality. To dismiss them as empty ritualists does not appear to do them justice. Teixeira's view that the Qumran community is to be identified with the Ebionites of early Christian history has been refuted by the evidence of archaeology. The age and contents of the scrolls indicate a pre-Christian origin. While it is wise to counsel caution, the preponderance of evidence indicates that the members of the Qumran community were Marian Essenes. It's in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible. In summary, the Qumran community withdrew from participation in the corrupt temple, believing that the wicked high priest had compromised with the various political movements dominating Palestine. They formed a separate community on the northwest side of the Dead Sea and required rules of holiness for its membership. They were a separatist sectarian community. That was a mouthful. But as we see here, it goes back to that group splitting off. And just as Mike had mentioned, through political movements dominating that area, like I just mentioned a little bit ago, we've seen what happened with the kings when they started allowing those of different religions and faiths being in the city walls and trying to appease them. And that's where that compromising takes place, trying to appease everybody and not staying true to God. So we can see there, we could show support for these people that split off trying to keep that purity. I think it says there on 192, that sect of the teacher of righteousness and his followers, they can't really nail it down exactly who. They think it's the Essenes, but as we see as we go back and forth here, they're just not quite sure. Anybody have any thoughts here?
It's interesting, this division. When we read our New Testaments, we can read the Pharisees and Sadducees, the lawyers, and so there would be little, it wouldn't be a huge thing to believe that there were other minority groups that were divided amongst the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they were even divided religiously between the resurrection and a resurrection and no resurrection. So this evidently was the same thing. And we see it today, sadly to say. Seems like it never stops. Of course, the devil's having his way by dividing up religious groups, get them to dispute one another and separate them, and then they get into their little covens and their own particular doctrines. That's where all of our denominations have come from, is somebody's particular belief that they can't validate with the Bible, but they will sure pervert a lot of scriptures, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, to deny that Jesus is God. I mean, that and a few other tenets is what really started that organization, and it just keeps blooming and growing, and same way with the difference between the Catholicism and denominationalism. There's the division again, and then each one of those groups divide from another group, and it's really sad, and it shows us how difficult it is today to be able to get through all that muck and get into the minds of people and teach them the truth, and then them understanding, okay, this is what the Bible says. Let's just stick with the Bible. Let's don't stick with doctrines and think-sos and ideas and different groups, whether it's Essenes or the Sadducees or the Pharisees. There was also a group of Jews that went around, and I don't know if they were the Essenes, that they carried daggers in their coats, and they would come up to Roman soldiers and stab them in the back and kill them because they hated the Romans so much.
Yeah, one that was that's how the Maccabean period started. I believe was it Matthias that killed a one that was getting ready to do the sacrifice and killed him, and then his sons.
Yeah, that was a different nation, though, I think.
Yeah.
But these people were doing the New Testament time when Christ was here. They were killing the Romans. That's why eventually we have AD 70, because of the political turmoil in Jerusalem, and finally it blew up. Rome came in and destroyed the city and destroyed the temple. Right.
Well, you mentioned Christ. We think about the problems we'll say for now, the Essenes, the ones that split off. They had a problem with what's say here? Yeah, Judaism, and well, what did Christ have a problem with as far as the Pharisees and Sadducees? What did he have problems with? The same thing. Was he proud of the way they was handling themselves? Was he proud of the money changers being in the temple? No. So he was following basically Jesus' teaching. They was trying to keep it pure, so we can respect that. I think we need to keep that in context with what we see. And we look here at the top of the page. There's the number 4 cave, where several most important scrolls were found. And we think about it, what they did then, we do that today. I mean, there's businesses, the government, they put things deep underground where they can control temperature, humidity, and everything to preserve very important documents or even works of art, whatever. So these people weren't, as we talked about before, they weren't backwards. They knew what they was doing. They picked out a good spot to where it was dry, no humidity, and stored them in those jars, as Bob said, to protect them. Richard.
I'll go back to something you read here on page 93, where it said that the Quorum's emphasis was on obedience to the law, with the Essenes of the emphasis on ceremonial purity. Well, it would seem you should have had both.
Yeah.
Which leads us to something we get into today. There's certain churches and certain groups put emphasis on one particular area of what's said in the Bible over other things, when we have to consider all things together.
Yeah, they have to take things out of context, and
that's the whole emphasis. Some of it's one part.
Exactly.
Some of the denominations, I know there's an emphasis on the Holy Spirit, some on other things, And then the rest of it, part of it is just left out.
Yeah, instead of following the whole
It
word.
all has to be included.
Good point. Good point. And I think it goes back to what Mike's saying, that with all the different sects and beliefs, and what you're saying also, just following parts of the word. Yeah, it's Satan's plan. Just like we see an example with the Jewish nation, they divided them and had them conquered. And that's what happens with when you get away from the word and start putting man's own spin on things. You get divide, and we're getting conquered. The many ways of man are not staying true to what God puts before us. And I think what Richard says is a good point, that you need to follow the whole word, not just pieces and parts. And I think that's, at least these people was trying to preserve that word, that inspiration for future prosperity. So they need to be commended for that.
You said they chose an area too, earthenware would breathe. Now, if that was glazed, like the pottery that they did, then it could draw moisture inside of it.
Yeah.
And it would stay. Now, with earthen pottery, air would move through it and take that moisture out and keep it at a certain temperature, a certain moisture level too, because of earthenware. I know certain pots, if you plant a plant in, that certain pots are better than other pots because some will let it breathe where others won't.
Right. Yeah, with that glaze on there, it could condensate and hold it in. So yeah, that's a good point. So these people were smart with what they was doing. And what we see with the, as it mentions there, the chronological limits set by the established age of the documents. Can they actually know when these documents were from?
Because of Josephus and a few other early writers, I'm sure they could.
Yeah, they're close.
That's the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they can date it to a period, and from a historical, archaeological piece, it's the original. So it's the oldest text of some of these things. But, you know, it's Septuagint or others that are writing and rewriting, and things would get old, so you'd rewrite it, and it might have happened, you know, a couple thousand years ago, but if it's rewritten in today's text, somebody might suggest that it's inaccurate, or it's uninspired. Well, here we have what the experts can only concede, that these events that are written were the scrolls were written on, you know, very early before Christ.
Right.
And then when we begin to see what's written in them, they can't say it was a contemporary writing in the days of Christ, or written after the fact. And the prophecies are much more able to be established when even those experts conclude that, yeah, that whatever was written hundreds of years before the event.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. Think about those prophecies that was there, and we know it was over 100 years before the time of Christ. Yeah, that's a huge thought.
Yeah, we have our Bibles, you know, we know where it's handed down from, but they have a copyright, so, you know, it was actually written on a certain day. It was printed on a certain day. And any of our Bibles that we have today are printed after the events that it records.
Right.
Even the prophecies, it was written after the prophecies. And in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the experts concede that those were written on those leather scrolls prior to the dates of the events that it talks about. So
That it foretold of.
that were told up, yeah. So that's think from an archaeological standpoint, that's the significance of the scrolls.
Yeah. And I think goes along also with these scrolls, how when we started this book, how it wanted to refute everything that the Bible had in it. Because, well, there's no record of it. Well, we know that's because then they was using clay tablets. They'd write things in stone. Not easy to transport. We're to a time now to where they had the ability to write it on papyrus or to write it on these leather scrolls and knew how to preserve them. So it just shows how far they had come from being a nomadic tribe to being in the community and having the time, the knowledge, and the people to do this with. So it just shows a progression of everything up to this point. And I think, as Mike mentioned, that God's hand in seeing these preserved to where these scholars found them. And yeah, they was before the prophecy happened.
Yeah, this specific piece of leather and this specific inscription which on that piece of leather is not only recording those things, it is established as being written prior to. Not the summary of the event, but the actual inscription is conceded to be written by the experts. They concede that it was actually inscribed prior to the life of Christ.
Right.
That's significant.
Yes, it is. Yes. And I think you just see God's hand in that, of them being preserved and being found the way they were and taken care of the way they were. I mean, to only lose one scroll, probably for somebody mishandling it, but have all the others still there for us to be able to study to this day, it's quite an amazing feat.
When you look at the preservation of the Bible itself, period, as Ron was mentioning, alluding to 1 John chapter 5, and I think it's verse 7. I don't have it particularly written here, but in the entire Bible, there's only a few words that are in dispute as to the translations. And many of those, such as the Septuagint, or it's also called the 70, they were 70 scholars that literally meticulously translate the Bible. Well, sometimes they would read something and put a footnote inside.
Right.
And some of those footnotes will poke up. That's what they think with 1 John 5 and 7, which I think is the right verse, I'm not sure, that they think some of those things were picked up. But, I mean, here we're talking about a book organized over all these years, and the only errors they can come up with are just a few words that literally doesn't change the text at all.
Right.
Doesn't change the truth, doesn't change anything teaching. It's just that, and it's possible that, you know, somebody had their particular idea and they would write a note on it so that would kind of key something in their mind, much like we write in our Bibles, we put notes in them.
Yeah.
So hopefully no one will come up along later on and think, oh, well, look at all this writing. This must have been in the Bible too, and which it wasn't, it isn't.
Yeah. Well, you look at it from Old Testament to New, it doesn't contradict itself. It flows from the beginning to the end. And we know man couldn't keep an account like that without having some type of contradictions in between different writers, especially the Old Testament and the New Testament. We see how it is inspired. That when man writes, you have different thoughts within because you have those different people writing. Here we have different people telling us God's word, but it all comes together. It doesn't contradict. It goes from the prophecies to the actuality to what's coming in the future for us. So that's very important to remember.
Yeah, all the internal, external things. And that's one thing I think the study's helping to add a little more weight to, if we want to use it that way, is that we do have the inspired word. We have all of it, as God said. There's none lacking. There's, like I said, just a few words between these two testaments. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, wherever they found full copies of Ezekiel or other books, they're the same as it's in our Bible.
Right.
Which was translated by other men over later years, and it's still the same. So there's really only two conclusions. Number one, that the Bible is inspired, it's infallible. And number two, there is a God, because, as you just mentioned, that couldn't exist by man. Man couldn't do that.
Right.
That's far beyond man's ability. And so you can see why the atheists and agnostics hate the Bible so much, is because of the evidence, because there really is no other conclusion when you look at the evidence that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, and that there is a God. It has to be, because we couldn't have such a book.
Exactly. And like I said, with all everything, how it just flows, you look at what the archaeologists do. For every archaeologist that has studied an area, you can probably come up with a whole lot of different interpretations between going from one to another. And that's because the way man is. But God's not that way. He keeps everything flowing one after another. And we know it's a reason to look at it, that it is inspired, and to, as Richard said, take the whole word, not just parts of it. And I think it's important what Richard has said before about, well, Mike was talking about the variance of a few words in the Bible. Well, from their time to our time, those few words mean different things. And that even in our language now, words constantly change, take on new meanings, or, how some spellings have been different. We've seen that with names in our past studies. Names of kings or names of areas, it could just be one or two letters off. And we know that at the beginning of the language, they didn't use vowels. It was all consonants. So how many, you're trying to translate something like that, and they started using the vowels in there, yeah, you're going to have some variance. But all in all, taking the whole context, everything goes together from beginning to end.
Well, there are no significant variants.
No.
That's the point. They don't
Yeah.
exist in the Bible.
Right.
And it's not a matter of interpretation or the changing of the language. It's still the same. Even though because it was written in Greek, so that's why the Koine Greek, which is now a dead language, we can go back, and that means exactly today what it meant back then, because that language died, and so those words never changed. English does, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But it was written in Greek and some Aramaic,
Right.
which hasn't changed. And so, just the evidence is just overwhelming when you start looking at it.
And I think, like Ron said about them being written before the time of it taking place, how big of a slap do you need to make you realize it's inspired, it's God-breathed? So, we're quickly running out of time. I did want to read on page 92, Josephus on the Essenes. We'll get through this. Josephus writes about the Essenes, spelled Essenes in the Whiston translation of Josephus, saying that the Essenes are Jews by birth and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. These Essenes reject pleasures as an evil, but esteem continence, or self-control, and the conquest over our passions, to be virtue. They neglect wedlock, but choose out other persons' children while they are pliable and fit for learning, and esteem them to be of their own kindred, and form them according to their manners. They do not absolutely deny the fitness of marriage and the succession of mankind thereby continued, but they guard against the lascivious behavior of women, and are persuaded that none of them preserve their fidelity to one man. Emphasizing that they practice socialism, Josephus says, "It is a law among them that those who come to them must let what they have be common to the whole order, insomuch that among them all there is no appearance of poverty or excess of riches, but every one's possessions are intermingled with every other's possessions, and so there is, as it were, one patrimony among all the brethren. They think that oil is a defilement, and if one of them be anointed without his own approbation, it is wiped off his body, for they think to be sweaty is a good thing, as they do also to be clothed in white garments." He continues, "Moreover, there is another order of Essenes who agree with the rest as to their way of living and customs and laws, but differ from them in the point of marriage, as thinking that by not marrying they cut off the principal part of human life, which is the prospect of succession. Nay, rather, that if all men should be of the same opinion, the whole race of mankind would fail. However, they try their spouses for 3 years, and if they find that they have their natural purgations thrice as trials that they are likely to be fruitful, they then actually marry them. But they do not use to accompany with their wives when they are with child, as a demonstration that they do not marry out of regard to pleasure, but for the sake of posterity. Now the women go into the baths with some of their garments on, as the men do somewhat girded about them. And these are the customs of the Essenes." In another place, Josephus adds, "And when they send what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not suffer sacrifices, because they have more pure lustrations of their own, on which account they are excluded from the common court of the temple, but offer their sacrifices themselves. Yet it is their course of life better than that of other men." Josephus says that Essenes have all things common, practice socialism, breaking down social barriers. He tells it that they are numbered about 4,000. They are not confined to one location. When members of the group travel, they depend on the hospitality of their brethren to provide them food and lodging. They do not marry or have servants, thinking that the latter tempts men to be unjust, and the former gives the handle to domestic quarrels. They minister to one another. Those who wanted to join the group were expected to go through a trial period for 1 year to see if they could live according to the Essene code. What I just read there, does that remind anybody of any groups of today?
It seems to be a common theme with men that there's groups today that are espousing basically that nobody owns anything, and that everybody's got to be the same.
Yeah.
Which is socialism or communism in other forms. But that's what these monasteries were about too, if you study church history.
Right.
And getting away from the flesh. One group beating their bodies, the other groups believing that I can't think of their names now, who believe just the opposite, that you can indulge in those things, but it wasn't sin like the other groups believed that it was sin. And so because you're spirit, you're not body anyhow, so it doesn't make any difference what you do in the body. Things like that. So these ideas are still around.
Yeah, it's still around, still being practiced. And they're I forget what it was I was watching, but there's one over around Asia somewhere. One group, they all run towards this temple, and the one that gets there is supposed to get a wish, or be blessed or something like that. But it's crazy. I mean, these people were trampling over each other. And like Mike says, you have the ones that want to flog themselves, or the ones that believe that the physical body doesn't matter. It's the spirit. It's all these things of man's, what he says, wisdom, or man's ways of what they want to take.
The Gnostics are the ones I was trying to think of. The Greek Orthodox, their Christmas is, of course, in January, and they have this ceremony, and the priest comes out, or they're not priests, they're patriarchs, comes out, and they have a place there in Tarpon Springs in Florida, and it's a inlet that comes in a bay-like, and he'll kiss the cross and make a special sign and throw it in the water, and all these boys will jump in. Whoever finds that cross gets a special blessing for that year.
Right. Well, one last thing before we close here. As I read that, I don't want you all to think that using deodorant or anything else is bad and that sweaty is being a good thing, because I want to be able to sit here with you, so let's keep that in mind. All right, I thank everybody for your help. Good class, good comments.